time for us to begin this evening. Just a minute, John Parrish will lead us in prayer. A number of people we need to keep in our minds, in our prayers. John and Marie Centers, need to definitely continue to remember them. John is at home. He's doing okay. He's dealing with, obviously, COVID and pneumonia, so please remember him. Marie is doing some better. They actually think they're going to put a trach in, which sounds horrible, but it's better than what she has been going through. So please remember her. There's by no means a decision necessarily made yet, but need to remember her. Eric Embry as well. He's having some heart issues. Goes to the doctor tomorrow, and then may have a procedure on Friday. Tom Spar, need to remember as well. Remember Alan Burton, also with his eyes. Need to remember him. And then Stan Porter as well. He'll be having procedure next week. So, is there anybody else anyone like to announce? All right, John.
Father in heaven, we come to you thanking you for this beautiful day that you bless us with. We thank you for this opportunity we have to study your word. Father, we ask you to be with all those that are not able to make it out with us tonight. Be with all those that were just mentioned with health issues. Father, we thank you for this opportunity and ask you to be with us. Concentrate on your word and learn more about you. Through your son we pray. Amen.
All right, 1 Samuel, the 26th chapter is where we're going to begin. Just a moment. 1 Samuel 26. Now, as we've been talking about, we're obviously in this part where Saul is chasing David. This is going to be another one of those chapters where that occurs. And as we go through this, just pay attention to the change between chapter 26 and 27 of David in particular and what happens with him. And I think there's some lessons that we can learn from that. But when we get into chapter 26, and again, like last week, I'll just put the questions up here, and we'll just kind of go through the chapter itself. So David comes up, and he is overlooking Saul's camp. Okay, and what does he see when he is overlooking his camp? What does he see? Some of you will be doing this in a few minutes. Some of you during the nighttime. Sleeping. Yeah, very good. Sleeping. So he's sleeping, and there's a group that's around him because he's the king, right? So there's protection that's going to be around him. And David decides, you know what? Let's go down there. Okay? So this is the David we know when he's in these moments. Let's go. I'm going to go down there. And so he asks a couple of guys if they'll go with him. Abishai says, yeah, let's go. I'll go down there with you. And so they go down there. Right? And then you get to verse 8. What does his companion want to do? Kill him. It's exactly what you should do in a normal situation. You have the opportunity to kill the one. Matter of fact, what word is used here that he wants to do to him? It's used when he's talking about what Saul wanted to do to David. What's he say in verse 8? Pin him to the ground. All right, let's pin him to the ground. It's exactly what Saul said to the wall, but he wanted to pin him. Let's just pin him to the ground. David, though, as only David does, in verse 9 says, do not kill him, for who can reach out with his hand against the Lord's anointed and remain innocent? David also said, as the Lord lives, the Lord certainly will strike him, or his day will come that he dies, or he will go down in battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I would reach out with my hand against the Lord's anointed. But now please take the spear in his head and a jug of water, and let's go. Now, David, when he was in the restroom with Saul, and here have long speeches when they're about to do something to him. Right? So, in order for this to be the case, who do you think is involved with them sleeping? What does it say in verse 12? This is the key. God. So God, it says in verse 12 at the end, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen on them. That is why they were asleep. That's why nobody got up and did anything to them. when David goes down there. Certainly they would have been paying attention, and David's going to actually bring that up here in a second. But this was God's involvement in this situation. Who is David concerned about? Why would David not kill Saul? Why would he not kill him? Sean?
Because he was the Lord's anointed, he knew that he would be in trouble.
Okay, he would be in trouble with God to that point, right? This is about God. I'm not going to kill him. I can't kill him and remain innocent before him. I cannot kill Saul. It had nothing to do with Saul. It didn't mean that he was happy that Saul was chasing him and doing all the things that he was doing with him. He certainly didn't like it. Matter of fact, as before, and we'll see here in just a minute, this is going to be, God's going to take care of you, Saul. He's going to take care of you. Right? So you have that perspective of David where he's absolutely not willing to go against God. Even though in this situation, I think a lot of people would say, I can see why he would want to kill him. And a lot of people that were very good men that were with David absolutely wanted to kill him. And so it's an interesting perspective of David that we've been talking about a lot, obviously, that we see here. So there's a deep sleep that falls upon him. He has the spear and he has the water. They cross over to the other side. And who does David call out to? In verse 14. Abner. Who's Abner?
King's bodyguard.
The bodyguard. David's taunting of this is hilarious to me. In verse 15, are you not a man? And who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not guarded your Lord the king? For one of the people came to kill the king your Lord. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, all of you undoubtedly must die, because you did not guard your Lord, the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is and the jug of water that is at his head. He's holding them. Say, verse 21. I have sinned. I have sinned, David. In both cases, in my opinion, in 24 and 26, you have situations where you see Saul, when he is facing death head on, he knows that he should be dead at this particular moment. David absolutely spared his life. There is no other way that he would be alive, except for David allowed him to be alive. Okay? That is an amazing situation to find yourself in once, let alone twice in this situation. I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will not harm you again, since my life was precious in your sight this day. Behold, I have played the fool and have made a very great mistake. All right? Interesting response. And what happens? What does David do? What does he give back to David or to Saul? The spear. You can have the spear back. Take your spear. In verse 24, though, what does he say was very valuable? What does he say? His life. Saul's life was very valuable. David's life wasn't very valuable necessarily to Saul from the perspective that if I can kill him, it'll continue in my family. At least that's what Saul's view was. I'm willing to kill him. David, though, his perspective is that your life is highly valued in the sight of the Lord. Okay, so again, you have this perspective of him looking to God in all the things that he is doing. It's an amazing example. Verse 25, then Saul said to David, blessed are you, my son David. You will both accomplish much and assuredly prevail. So David went on his way, and Saul returned to his place. Okay, so this is a fascinating end to this chapter. Right? He tells him very clearly, you're blessed, and he calls him son David. Okay? There are other times where he's so mad he will not even say his name. Where is Jesse's son? Oh, David, you're my son. Yes, I'm your son because I could have killed you, is why I'm your son. Here's your spear. They go their separate ways, but the transition that happens between 26 and 27 is fascinating. Okay? So we're going to compare them in just a minute. But are there any thoughts, comments on chapter 26 itself? Brian? Yeah, it's amazing when you can sit and read it, how often this occurred. Even if this was some time in between. This is huge events that we're talking about. But we can do this very quickly. How often we can get caught, and not something as big as this situation, but we get caught, I will never do this again. I am so sorry. And if this was written, our life was written down, how often would you say that exact same thing over the exact same situation and continue doing the exact same thing that you had done before? This is like the cycle you see in Judges. This is humans. This is what we do. It's interesting when you can sit and read it, and to Brian's point, from a chronological standpoint and from a year standpoint, how much time goes by. We don't know necessarily. There's guesses, educated guesses, but it's an interesting thing that you find of Saul, and it's his character, and certainly it's a lesson that we can learn. But as we get into 27, there's an amazing lesson to learn from David. And I want you to understand really what's going to happen here when we get to 27. And so let's look at the first couple of verses here. What is David's concern? Not even concern. What is he scared of? Saul's going to kill him. Saul's going to kill him. What is interesting about David's perspective of this, do you think? What does he say? Ann?
Well, I think he forgives Saul what's happening. He won't do something against Saul, but he also understands the reality, and the reality is Saul is going to kill him. So he knows how to forgive. He knows how to put God first by not killing Saul. He has the opportunity to, but he also has to protect himself.
Okay. All right. Brian?
Part of me wants to blame David for not having faith in the Lord and staying there, and the other part of me wants to raise him up as what a man of faith that I'm going to go to the hands of the enemy and confident that the Lord's going to protect me.
Yeah.
He does that.
So this is the interesting thing with this particular story, in my opinion. When David is facing something that is very quick, so he goes down and he sees Goliath, and he's so mad, and he's going to take Goliath on, and he takes the giant on. I'm going to stand for God. That is an amazing story. Some of us, though, are going to understand this part of David, where you're just relentlessly being followed, and you're relentlessly dealing with the exact same thing, and there's something that is keeping you down and just beating you over the head time and time and time and time again, until the point you're just like, it's going to kill me. What should David had known was not going to happen to him from a logical perspective? What did he know?
He was still alive.
Yeah.
After all that he had faced, God had protected him.
Yeah.
Logically, he should have known wherever he was, God was going to protect him.
When the omnipotent tells you you're going to be king, that obviously, in and of itself, means Saul's not going to kill you. Right? We understand that from a logical standpoint. That doesn't mean he didn't have a role to play in it and getting away. There's no question about that. But it's the same thing for us. God says, I'm giving you eternal life. Nothing can take that away from you. And we get scared of the creation. We get scared of the other people. Why? Why would we do that if we know that we have something? Because we're human. And it's the same thing with David here. David is human. And there's a difficulty that he's dealing with that, in my opinion, is difficult for him. In certain situations, when you just see him get up and his bravery and his trust in God, at that moment, boom, I'm going after Goliath. When it's time and time and time and time again, he's human. There's going to be times where he gets down. This isn't the only time. And there's times when we get down. 2020 beats you down every day. Right? There comes a point in time where you're like, please, now hopefully this was early on in 2020, but please, stop. Let's stop. Let's go is there anywhere this is not happening at this moment? So we have this perspective, we can understand this, and David is no different than any of us. Sometimes, though, we put David on a pedestal and forget that he's human. He was a man of faith, a man of God, is somebody to follow his example of, but he also felt sadness and anger and despair. And in some cases, when we read some of the Psalms, it's almost from a depression standpoint. He was going through tremendous difficulties, and this is no different here. And to Brian's point, he goes to the enemy. That's how scared he is of what Saul was doing. John?
And it appears to me that he always knows how to stay one step ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the interesting thing with this, and I think that especially when you get into chapter 24 that we talked about before is the idea that it's God moving him, telling him where to go. You need to go on the other side, get on the other side. Yeah. It becomes Paul in the New Testament. It's Saul right now. Ann?
I do think there is some wisdom, though, in removing yourself from a situation. So, as humans, because David is human, if I continue to put myself in the same situation, that takes me away from my faith in God. It takes me away from being the influencer that I need to be and being the light that I need to be. I need to know when to say, I'm going to leave this job, or I'm going to leave this family member that is doing this to me. Like, I'm not talking about through, like the divorce type situation, but you just have to know when to ask for help and or leave a situation, get some help, and understand that some fights can't be done just by yourself.
Yeah.
You've got to remove yourself from the situation to be able to get help from God, focus on God, and have other people help you through
Yeah.
that.
And it's okay. I think that as time goes on, especially in our time, that we can kind of understand this better than perhaps other past generations did. The idea of the struggles that go on, the mentality, the mental illnesses that people deal with, the anxiety, the different things, and it's not such a stigma when it comes to Christians. Christians deal with this as well. God's people deal with these things. Okay? And so you have the same thing here with David. David is being bombarded. He is absolutely being chased by the king, and not just the king. Saul is sending people out after him, not to get into much of the Psalms, but some of the Psalms will talk about he was sending not only assassins to try to kill him, but character assassins to talk to other people and say how bad David was. So he's facing so much. And by the way, this does not end when Saul dies. This continues on, which we're not going to get into in this quarter, but that's an amazing thing to me when you think about David and his life. And this was something that Jonathan had brought up last week. We talk about David, but David's life was this the whole time. This is what he struggled or dealt with, the various things that came up in his life. He turned to God. He would struggle. He was human. And it's no different for you and for me. And it's okay. It's okay when you have those days and those moments when you need to get away and do the things that you need to do. Our Savior did it when he was here on earth. There were times where he just said, I have to get away. Let's go away. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to pray. Let's just get away from the people. Okay? And if Jesus can do it, guess who else can do it? And we understand and the importance of being able to do those things and the wisdom that comes with being able to do this. However, not many of us would go over to the Philistines. That might be where we draw the line in some cases, but David does. And David's, the situation that occurs here in chapter 27 is so fascinating when you get down into what occurs here. But any thoughts before, Jonathan?
Yeah, you're right. It's hard to know how to view these next few chapters, whether this was the first of a series of very poor decisions by David or this was okay. I mean, he ends up in a web of lies and he gets into a point where he's on the battlefield. He's not even, it seems like, does he even know what he's going to do? Is he going to kill these people, and mercifully there's like an escape ramp for him to get out of there. But I guess when I look at these chapters, the one thing that's clear is that God is very merciful to David. So he protects him, and whether David's doing right or wrong by going to the Philistines, the people that Israel was supposed to stay away from, by saying these things that aren't true. I mean, whether it's right or wrong, God is gracious to him and protects him and is with him throughout all this.
Yeah. It's a great point. And that's the same for us, right? There are going to be times you're going to make decisions and you're going to try to do what's in the best interest, and you're going to have the right mindset that you're doing it, and other people may look at it and say, I don't think that's what I would have done. And who cares? This wasn't you. This was my decision. This is David's decision at this moment. Everywhere I go in Israel, Saul is following me. He's there. Guess where he's not going to follow me? Gath. The problem is, the Philistine people weren't very excited about David in the beginning because he, killed Goliath. They kind of frowned on that. And he killed a lot of other people too. And so there was some interesting, difficult situations that David himself finds himself in. And we can look at it and we can be very critical when we look at other people's decisions and the things that they do, rather than just saying you made the best decision that you could at that time with the information that you had at the time. And God has mercy on you. God was merciful with you just like he is with me. And praise be to God for that, because of his tremendous mercy for David and that he has for us as well. Right?
So in 21, the first time he goes to Achish, he feigns madness and is spitting all over himself, right? And Achish kind of kicks him out. I got enough crazy people of my own. I would love to know when he writes Psalm 34, right? Where that one falls in this time frame. I know there's a lot of time going on here, but this time when he goes, he is deceptive to Jonathan's point, but he's confident in who he is, right?
Yeah.
And he stands very confident in that. And in his deception, he's actually doing what the Israelites should have done in the first place. He's going out and he's killing all the tribes that they should have wiped out when they moved in the first place, which was what Saul should have been doing.
Mm.
You know, and so he's doing his kingly duty, and I get we can rationalize or not rationalize or whatever, but he is doing what God commanded him to do. He is fulfilled.
Yeah, 27 shows what it's like to be a politician, right? I'm going to make both sides happy in this moment. Just one side's not going to realize that I'm doing something that I'm not really doing to them. The Philistines. Oh, he's wiping out Israel. They're going to hate him. No, not really. He's going in that area. This is before, Google Maps. You couldn't tell where he was going. He would say, I'm going to the desert of Negev. Oh, he must be taking on Israel. Yeah, no. So it's interesting how David handles the Philistines, how he still handles Israel, how he's doing all his things, even to the point of when he asked for the city. And then it talks about the city was his for the rest of the time. So he was getting land during this time. The amazing thing as we go through this story is that he goes over and he says, look, Saul's going to kill me. He goes over with 600 men with him. He goes up to the king of Gath, as it says in verse 2, and then he takes his family with him. And then verse 4 it says, now it was reported to Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he no longer searched for him. Why would that be? Why do you think he just stopped searching for him? What do you think? Right. Okay. He knows where he is. What else? If the next anointed king decides that he's going over to stay with the enemies, what is that may happen from the perspective of the people of Saul, do you think? Is that a positive look? And all of a sudden, the king is over with the Philistines. He's over there. He didn't want to go over there necessarily because he didn't want to fight Gath in and of itself. But I think, for me, anyway, some of the pieces of this is the fact that he left Israel. He's not here. The king's gone. The anointed one that is coming is gone. And it's fascinating, Saul's perspective, and at least from my view, that Saul still thinks that God is with him. He's gone over to the enemy. Great, I'm going to stay here in Israel. I'll stay here. And you see what's going to happen a little bit later on. But it's amazing, David's perspective. However, while David's here, he continues to grow. Because what's happening at this time is that people are leaving Israel and they're coming to David. So if you look at 1 Samuel, the 27th chapter, he goes and he gets Ziklag. Okay, so that's where he's going to be. If you turn over to 1 Chronicles chapter 12, this is where 1 Samuel, the Kings, and the Chronicles kind of get intertwined to some degree. But in 1 Chronicles, we find that David is in Ziklag. Okay, so this is the city that he's in. And in verses 1 through 22, we find that a lot of people leave Israel that were Jews and come to him. Okay, so they come to him. And there's a lot of them that come to him. And they are mighty men that it'll talk about here that come to him. And it's a fascinating story when you kind of read this. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Well, verse 1. Now these are the men who came to David at Ziklag while he was still restricted because of Saul the son of Kish. And they were among the mighty men who helped him in war. They were equipped with bows, using both the right hand and the left to sling stones and shoot arrows with a bow. They were Saul's kinsmen from Benjamin. Okay? So he wasn't very popular with his own crowd. And then it goes on and just lists these people's names. And I know for us, you get in these people's names, you're like, yeah, all these different names. But the whole point of what's being said here is that mighty people go and be with David. They're leaving Saul, including his own people in the tribe, and going with Saul. Or going with David, rather. They're leaving Saul. It is amazing. In verse 8, from the Gadites, valiant, mighty men went over to David at the stronghold in the wilderness, men trained for war who could handle a large shield and spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions, and they were as swift as gazelles on the mountains. Amazing. So David is over in Ziklag, and he's building his army. He's getting bigger. His followers are getting bigger here in 1 Chronicles, the 12th chapter. You go back to chapter 27, and you don't really get that information as much here in chapter 27 of 1 Samuel that you do in 1 Chronicles. Now, all of a sudden, the 600 men that he had is a lot more people. Okay? So it's a lot of people that he's going to have. These are some of the Psalms. We'll just put them up here so you can see them. You turn to Psalm 56. Psalm 56 would have been written around this time. So if you read the psalm title itself, it talks about when the Philistines seized him in Gath. The Bible does not ever say that he is seized in Gath. However, when you read chapter 27 of 1 Samuel, you can see into chapter 28, you can see when this is going to occur. Okay, there was a lot of difficulty trying to figure out if David was a spy, if he was with them, was he going to turn against them? There's a lot of things that go on. So David writes this beautiful psalm. It says, "Be gracious to me, God, for a man has trampled upon me. Fighting all day long he oppresses me. My enemies have trampled upon me all day long, for there are many who fight proudly against me. When I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I have put my trust. I shall not be afraid. What can mere mortals or mere man do to me? All day long they distort my words, and their thoughts are against me for evil. They attack, they lurk, they watch my steps, and they have waited to take my life. Because of their wickedness, will there be an escape for them? In anger, make the people fall down, God." I'm going to stop there. You get the point. This is the one we read a couple weeks ago as well. It's the same time of what's going on. Put your tears in a bottle. God, if you actually care about this, take care of them. Take care of my enemies. We've all been in those well, maybe not exactly the same as him. Well, we've been in situations where you pray and say, "God, please take this from me. Take this from me." Sometimes he does, but every time he's going to be with you. The interesting thing to me about this psalm and some of the others that are up here is when he'll talk about in verse 3, "When I am afraid, I will put my trust in you." The question never was David afraid? He absolutely was afraid. There were times David was afraid. You read the stories and you think it's Superman. It's a man. It's David. He was afraid, but he trusted God. And when he got down, and he does get down, he turned to God. That's the key. That's the key for us. You can get down. You're going to get down. It's life. It's hard. Where's your next step? Where do you turn? Who do we lean on? Those are the things that we need to be mindful of. I'm afraid sometimes people get so discouraged by the fact that they're afraid or they're down. You're human. You're going to be. Where do you turn is the question. And it's okay. And that's where I love about David. Some of these psalms that he writes are so beautiful about that. Yes, I'm afraid, but I'm going to trust you, God. Yes, I'm afraid, but I have faith in you, God. That's the same for us. We need to make sure that we have that kind of attitude that we see here with David. If you go back to 1 Samuel, the 27th chapter, you can kind of pick up here. David goes out and he attacks, and this is what Brian had brought up earlier. He goes out and he'll attack various places. And you start in verse 8 and you follow here. You'll see where it kind of talks about this, the idea that he went up against the Gerishites, the Gerzites, the Amalekites, for they were inhabitants of the land from ancient times as you come to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt, in verse 8. David attacked the land and did not leave a man or a woman alive. He took the sheep, the cattle, the donkeys, the camels, and the clothing. Then he returned and came to Achish. Now Achish said, "Where did you carry out an attack today? Against the Negev of Judah, against the Negev of the Jerahmeelites, and against the Negev of the Kenites." Okay, so the Negev is a huge place. Okay, this isn't like I went to the city of Negev. This is the desert of Negev. It's big. So he says, I attacked the people that were there. I attacked them. What is the king of Gath's perspective of this? What does he think happened? Going after his people. It's amazing in verse 12. So Achish believed David, saying, he has undoubtedly made himself repulsive among his people, Israel. Therefore, he will become my servant forever. When the reality is verse 11 we'll talk about, that's not exactly what is occurring, what David is doing. He's actually taking off some of the people that, by the way, Saul should have killed at the time. And so he's going after the enemies of Israel, as we said earlier. So David is doing great things for the people of Israel, doing great things for them. And then from our perspective, and the perspective of the king here, he's telling him, no, he's going to be mine for forever. Now you get into chapter 28. All right? Did you just change that? Chapter 28. So this is where, to what Brian brought up earlier, that you have got to be understanding that this is not a chronological book in and of itself, necessarily. There are parts here that seem to have happened at different times. So the first two verses seem to be relative to the time here, but then you get into this, what's going on with Saul, and you get into this, him talking to this medium in just a few minutes, and it seems like there were some other things that occurred in between verses 2 and 3. Okay, so if you have chronological Bible as an example, there will be, in some of them, not all of them, there'll be other verses that are put here, other things that are talked about here. So this is one of those times, it doesn't change anything that goes on here other than the fact of if you're trying to read it and kind of go through this is not necessarily how it happened straight across. But 1 Samuel is never said to be a chronological book. So in verse 1, though, now it came about in those days that the Philistines gathered their army camps for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, know for certain that you will go out with me in the camp, you and your men. David said to Achish, very well, you will learn what your servant can do. So Achish said to David, then I will assuredly make you my bodyguard for life. You can imagine the difficulty that's going to come with this, right? Achish is all for taking David, all about it, and who wouldn't be? You have David, all the things that he is going to be able to do. It's just amazing to think about the power that David himself would have had. Now, later on, we'll get into this in this chapter. Maybe we'll get into it today. You'll see where the people that are with Achish decide that we can't take David. He cannot be with us. He's going to turn against us. And they're correct. That's what probably would have happened. But in the meantime, at least in 28, you have this crazy scene of Saul. Okay? And this is just Saul to a T, what happens here. So when you think about Saul, in verse 3, everybody mourns the death of Samuel. Okay? So it's very clear, just so you know, as we get to the rest of this, Samuel is dead. Right? Very important to the story. Saul goes up and he's going to start talking and wants to bring God into the picture. So he talks to God, and what happens? Doesn't answer him. There's no answer from God. There's no answer from God. And he wants to have an answer, right? The problem was, in the meantime, Saul had gotten rid of or would kill anybody who was a witch, doing witchcraft. Okay? They were going to get rid of them. However, in verse 7, what did Saul want? Somebody who's a medium. And where was she? Sounds like Lord of the Rings city. Endor, where she was. Up in Endor. If you look at a map, this is way up north in Israel. So you find there's a woman who was not doing a great job of hiding herself. In Endor, who was a medium. What does Saul do in verse 8?
He disguises himself.
The tallest man in the area disguises himself by putting on different clothes, it says, that's the way to do it. And he and took two men with him, and they came to a woman by night, and he said, consult the spirit for me, please, and bring up for me the one whom I shall name for you. What does the woman say? It's a trap. You're here to trap me. I'm not telling you I am a medium yet. You're just here to trap me. Verse 9, the woman said, behold, you know what Saul, so she doesn't know, he's very good disguise, has done, that he has eliminated the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why are you then setting a trap for my life to bring about my death? So Saul swore an oath to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Now, Saul's oaths that he has given before don't really hold water too much. But in this case, the lady's like, okay, I'm going to do this for you, right? And what happens here? Who shall I bring to you? And what does Saul say weirdly? Samuel. Samuel. Why would he want Samuel, do you think? Why Samuel? Besides, he's dead. But why Samuel? Saul and Samuel, at the end at least, Samuel had nothing that he was going to talk to Saul about. It certainly did not end well in their relationship. Brian?
Saul always relied on Samuel to know what to do. He could not own his relationship with the Lord. It was always through Samuel's direction of what the Lord actually wanted.
Yeah.
So he's directed.
It's amazing that relationship that they had. This had everything to do with Saul's perspective of Samuel. Samuel was God's man. Okay? It wasn't that he disliked Samuel. He didn't like maybe some of the things he said, but he knew he was telling him the truth. And ultimately, to Brian's point, what the big issue is Saul's relationship with God and how that relationship plays out. But he wanted Samuel. I want you to bring Samuel here, as it talks about here in verse 12. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. Now, what does verse 12 tell you about this medium? Sean?
She was tricking people, but until this situation.
It worked this time, right? There was something different about this time. You're not supposed to be here. This isn't supposed to work, right? So you have this situation here where this evidently is vastly different than normal to her. Okay, so she is scared to death, not only because obviously it worked, but Samuel's there. And if Samuel's there, what does she realize, or who does she realize just talked to her, asked her about it? Saul, you've deceived me. You've deceived me. I cannot believe that you are here. In verse 13, Saul says, do not be afraid, but what do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being coming up from the earth. And he said to him, how does he appear? He's an old man. He's coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe. Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his head and with his face to the ground and paid homage. Interesting. Even that part's interesting. All right? What does Samuel say to Saul? It would have been better if he didn't call him. Well, what does he say to him? Why do you keep calling me? I love verse 15, what Samuel says. Why are you disturbing me? Why are you disturbing me? You can get into this, and you can use your imagination and bring a lot of different things into what was going on. Where was Saul, or Samuel, what was going on? All the different pieces of it doesn't matter. Just the question that he asks is fascinating to me. Why are you disturbing me for this? Because quite frankly, what I'm about to tell you is exactly what you already knew is going to happen. I've already told you this before. Saul replies, I am very distressed, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has abandoned me and no longer answers me, either through prophets or in dreams. Therefore I have called you so that you may let me know what I should do, to Brian's point. I need his voice. I need him to tell me what I'm going to do. And so it's interesting, as we continue on, what he's going to be told. However, this is not going to be any different than anything else he has been told. In verse, we just read in verse 15, did God abandon Saul?
Yes.
Why?
He disobeyed.
Yeah. Because it was Saul. His choices that he made, God was not going to be with Saul. He wasn't with Saul anymore. That doesn't mean that Saul could not have done certain things and handled things that we've talked about before with repentance and various things. that he never did, that we've talked about previously. But you see that he understood that God is not answering me. He's not answering me in dreams. He's not answering me with prophets. If you remember, David still has a prophet with him, Gad, the seer, as he's called. And so you have very clearly that God is with David. There's no question about that in various forms. And so Samuel just thinks, look, I have to talk to somebody who has a little bit more information. So what does he say? In verse 16, why did he abandon you? Why? You're his enemy. You're his enemy, Saul. You're his enemy. When we go through these similar situations and it's where is God? Why is God? When people ask that and they don't have a relationship with God, this is the answer. You're his enemy is why. You don't have a relationship with him. He'll go on, obviously, and get into a little bit more. And the Lord has done just as he spoke through me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom from your hand and given it to your neighbor, to David. Just as you did not obey the Lord and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek, so the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Furthermore, the Lord will also hand Israel along with you over to the Philistines, so tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. And indeed, the Lord will hand the armies of Israel over to the Philistines. Shouldn't have called. Should not have called him. I'm so mad you're going to die tomorrow. Now, this was the plan. This was God's plan, obviously. But when you think about what Samuel says, you're going to be with me. He's not saying you're literally going to be with him in paradise or anything like that. That's not the point. He's saying you're going to be dead. You're dying tomorrow. Okay? So, again, understanding of that. You're going to be in the grave tomorrow is what's going to happen. What is Saul's reaction? He does exactly what any of us would do. He's scared to death, obviously. He falls to the ground. He was very afraid because of Samuel's words. There was no strength in him either because he had eaten no food all day and all night. And then the woman, and you can imagine her, what she just saw, and she's like, I can make you some food. You're going to die tomorrow. You may as well have some food to get some strength. He didn't want to eat, but he does go ahead and he's going to eat, and they're going to stay there. Then they got up and they left that night. They're going to go back. And then you get into 29, which obviously we'll get into next week. But it's an amazing conclusion, if you will, of what we've seen of Saul the whole time. And you're certainly continuing to see it. God's plan did not change because Saul did not change. And it's the exact same thing that we're going to see time and time again when we look at this man. Anybody else before we conclude? Brian?
I find it sad in this whole thing, too. He never once asked Samuel in this last thing, how do I get myself right?
Yep.
Right? Like, the Philistines are coming against me, and I don't know what to do. God's your adversary. He never once asked what should be the most obvious question, how do I fix that? Because that's the biggest problem. And I think we can be guilty of that, too, right? We keep looking at the fruit that is there, the most evident thing, and we don't look back at actually the fruit of what he's talking about.
Yeah, I think it was Jonathan a couple weeks ago that brought up when you look at Saul's life and how often when he's talking to somebody, it was always to a man, always talking to somebody. When David would pray or Samuel would pray, it's just a fascinating perspective. Forrest has sent me a message, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, but it's the idea that it was years later when it talks about Saul built his first altar to God. You know, that was not on his plate. That was not something that he did. And so when you see the lives that these men led, you can certainly see the ones that were following or striving to have a relationship with God, and others that were just knowing about God is powerful. Jonathan?
Saul is such a tragic figure because in some ways he's in the most dangerous place on earth as he knows the truth. He knows who to talk to about the truth, that he continues to be paralyzed by fear or whatever it is, that he just falls down and he just can't get over the hump, which is such a danger for all of us. It's like we know we're doing wrong because we know what the truth is, or maybe we'll pull out our Bible, or we'll all go to services with a friend, but we just, for whatever reason, just can't take the next step. You know, like people talk about obedience, and it's so dangerous because there's no more truth that can change Saul's mind. It's not like there's a message he hasn't heard yet, right? He's heard the message, he knows who to talk to, and he's not taking that step.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a good point to end on. We'll pick up 29. Maybe we'll finish 1 Samuel next week. Thank you.
under his wings we may seek refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and bulwark. You will not be afraid of the terror by night, or of the arrow that flies by day, the pestilence that stalks in darkness, or of the destruction that lays waste at noon. 1,000 may fall at your side, and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not approach you. You will only look and lift your eyes and see the recompense of your Lord. You have made the Lord my refuge, even the Most High, your dwelling place. No evil will befall you, nor will any plague come near your tent. For he will give his angels charge concerning you, to guard you in all your ways, that you will bear up